And guess what we're studying about tonight? So it's been mystery the last 3 weeks, right? Been looking at the resurrection of Christ, and Lord willing, continue to do that. I do kind of feel thankful that you guys do get a break next week since Tim, I guess next Sunday, since Tim is going to be here in our gospel meeting. And so maybe that will kind of break up the subject enough where you makes listening to me talk about the same thing bearable. I will just say this too, don't expect an Easter sermon. You're not going to get one on the resurrection of Christ. That's pretty close coming up. So we'll be through on that subject before that time period, hopefully. There were 40 days that Jesus, after his resurrection and before his ascension, that Jesus appeared and disappeared at will here upon this earth. And the Bible says that he appeared during those times to his disciples, and those disciples, I doubt they knew when he was going to appear and when he was going to disappear. And so they had to stay alert. But this was a very important part of their life and time, because they were about to take over God's work here upon this earth. You know, that's what Christ had been doing during his time here upon this earth, and they were basically stepping into his shoes, taking over his role in the spreading of the gospel, and of course going to all people to try to accomplish that. We're going to be looking tonight at John chapter 21. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to take them out and turn over there with me. We're looking at another lesson, of course, that involves the resurrection of Christ, but tonight we're going to look at some transformation that took place in the life of Peter, and that should take place in our lives too if we've encountered the resurrected Christ. Now, it is also, it's worthwhile just to point out, I think there's three main word pictures that we're going to dwell upon here in John chapter 21. And we want to talk about not just the word pictures themselves, but the responsibilities that are attached to each of these pictures. And so let's start out here in verse 1 of John chapter, I've got 20 up here. It should be chapter 21. I can still see that far, Dennis. Chapter 21. John chapter 21. The first thing that we'll see in this lesson is, because of the resurrection of Christ, we are called to be fishermen. And there's a couple of things before I actually read in the story itself that are important to consider. We know from Mark 16 and verse 7 that when the angel appeared at the tomb of Jesus to the women who had made that journey on the first day of the week, he told them to bring a message back to Jesus' disciples. And that message was that he was going to go and to meet them in the city of Galilee. They were supposed to go ahead and go over to the city of Galilee and wait for him there, and then he would appear to them there. So, as obedient disciples, these apostles journey toward the city of Galilee, and they arrive there, and I guess they're kind of like I am. They're impatient people, because I'm not very good at sitting around and waiting. What do you do while you're waiting for the resurrected Christ to appear? Well, Peter had an idea. He decided, let's go fishing. And that's what we read about in verse 3 of John chapter 21. Peter says to this group, he says, I go fishing. They say unto him, we also go with thee. It wasn't just out of boredom, I don't think, or something just to pass the time, or even from the standpoint of trying to find something to do before Christ returns, that they thought of fishing. You have to kind of understand a couple of things about this situation. First of all, these men had been dependent on Jesus for 3 years of their life to basically take care of it. I mean, they followed Christ. We know that the group of apostles had a money bag, kind of a community bag, that was, when funds were needed, they were drawn out of that bag. But now they're on their own. I mean, Jesus isn't there to take care of them. He isn't there to direct them. And so they have to live here upon this earth. And I think they went back to what they knew best. They were fishermen, or a lot of them were, before Jesus called them. And so if you need to make a little money, what do? Well, you do what you know and what you're good at. And to them, that was fishing. And so that's what they do. They set out to go fishing. Now, I did mention that there were some of Jesus' disciples that were fishermen before Jesus called them to be his apostles. At least 7 of the 12 disciples were fishermen. You ever, I don't think that's a coincidence. I would kind of think about, well, why in the world, all the people that you could pick, would he pick fishermen? And I got to think about, there's some quality of fishermen that are similar to the qualities of Christian. And again, I'm not talking about, these guys weren't hobbyist fishermen, okay? They weren't like we are today. Let's find something fun to do. This was their job. That was their occupation. And undoubtedly, they had to be good at it in order to sustain that job and that occupation. But what were some of the characteristics of, these were seamen. Again, we're talking about the Sea of Galilee here. We're not talking about a river or something small like that, but a very large body of water. But these people had to be courageous, didn't they? They had to be brave. They had to be willing to go out and brave the elements, face whatever the day had to bring toward them in order to accomplish their job. They didn't have weather stations and apps on their phones like we have today where you can get up to the minute updates, where a storm is coming or what you need to do. And so a lot of them had to, rely upon some of the things that they'd been taught growing up as to predict the weather and what to do in those situations. They had to be dedicated people. I mean, you couldn't just go out one day a week and go fishing and expect to make a good living. So they had to go out and be dedicated to their jobs. They had to be focused. You couldn't be a good fisherman if you're easily distracted. I think, though, probably what I would consider the most similar, maybe the best similarity between a fisherman and being a Christian is you cannot quit. You cannot give up. Because if you quit or you give up, you fail. And these people, again, they weren't just single individuals in one boat by themselves going out. This was a group effort. And so you had to be able to work together. You had to be able to cooperate. You had to be able to take orders if things were going to function and flow naturally like they should. All of those things, you think about that, those are very similar to what it takes to be a Christian. And so I don't think it's an accident that Jesus singled out and picked these men in order to follow him. But here's what happens. We read in verse 3, in the second part of verse 3, they went forth and they entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. Well, they weren't very good fishermen, were they? That's part of it. If you've ever fished, you know that it's called fishing, not catching, we said, right? And that means every time that you cast, to kind of relate it to our situation, the world that we live in today, that means that every time you throw your line out, it doesn't mean you go catch fish. But you have to have some patience, and you got to have some endurance. And so these guys did that. They went out patiently. They had endured all night long, the Bible says, but yet they had come up empty-handed. I couldn't help but think about Jesus' statement in John 15 and verse 5. He's talking about, I am the vine, you are the branches. He said, without me, you can do nothing. What were they able to catch without Jesus? Not one single fish. But suddenly Jesus appears upon the scene. And that changes everything. In fact, in verse 4, here's what we read of that same chapter, John 21. When the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. So after the resurrection of Christ, we've kind of noticed it seems to be that Jesus isn't easily recognized. And I don't know if that has to do with his appearance being altered or changed in some way, or maybe it's just the fact that ability to see and to recognize him is being withheld for a specific purpose. So I don't know what the case is. I just know this is one of those instances in the Bible where Jesus appears to his own disciples, but they don't recognize him. And so here they are. They fished all night, and here's a guy walking on the shore, and what does he do? In verse 5, he says unto them, children, have you any meat? King James Version says. In other words, do you have any food? Well, you can imagine if you've been out fishing all night and you caught nothing, and somebody walks up to you and says, hey, you got some fish to eat? That could rub you the wrong way, couldn't it? But I don't know that they replied. They were embarrassed by replying. I don't know if they were short and snappy, thinking, who's this guy and why is he asking us for something to eat? We've been out here working all night and he wants us to feed him, But they didn't know that it was Christ. And so John continues the story in verse 6. Jesus says unto them, cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. They cast therefore, and now they were not able to draw it in for the multitude of fishes. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved saith unto Peter, It is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he girded his fisher's coat unto him, for he was naked, and did cast himself into the sea. Well, it's time for Jesus to take over this story, to interject himself into it. And so Jesus asked them, do you have anything to eat? No, we don't have any fish. And he says, well, you need to throw your net over here. And so the Bible says they did what Jesus told them to do. And they caught, not by John's account here, but I think it's Luke that tells us 153 fish that they were able to pull in with that net. Again, fishing is one of those things where if you're not totally committed and if you're not locked in mentally, it's easy to get discouraged and it's easy to give up. I used to do a lot of fishing, don't do so much anymore, but boy, I can recall sometimes when I would take my wife and my children with me, they don't understand the concept of fishing. Because when I go fishing, I'm going to throw a line from daylight till dark. That's fishing. Doesn't matter if you're catching anything or not, you just fish because that's what you go for. And so if you're not catching anything, it's pretty easy to get discouraged, isn't it? Pretty easy to say, you know what, there's a lot better things I could be doing. There's a lot funner things that I could be doing. I think I'll just pack up and go home. But that's those disciples. They fished all night. They caught nothing. Jesus said, throw your nets in one more time. How easy would it have been just to say, you know what, we've done it all night. We haven't caught anything. One more throw isn't going to accomplish a thing. But they did what Jesus told them to do, and Jesus turned their failure into success. There's a lot of great lessons here, and obviously the application for us when we're talking about, because of the resurrection of Christ, we are called to be fishermen. We're talking about fishing for men, fishing for lost souls. But there's so many parallels and lessons that you could draw from this story. I jotted a few of them down here. If I ever remember where I put them down, I might make a sermon out of this sometime. But a couple of things that I wrote down. Well, the first one was Jesus turned their failure into success. If we don't follow Jesus' directions, we're never going to succeed. If they didn't listen to Christ and do what he told them to do, they never would have been able to catch those fish. Another thing I wrote down is the difference between success and failure was the width of a ship. The problem was they were just, a few feet away from where they needed to be fishing. And I often think about when I'm out there fishing, how many close calls do you have that you never really see? It may have just been inches away from a fish or centimeters away from a fish biting your bait and being able to catch something. But the difference between success and failure is not a very large gap. And usually, number three, we're closer to success than what we realize. Again, I think about the principle of fishing. I don't know how many fish are in a body of water. I often wonder that when I'm out there and not getting a bite. But I imagine that bait goes by hundreds, if not thousands of fish every time you go on a fishing trip. And the difference between success and failure is just so minute. And probably a lot of times we're a lot closer than we realize to catching a fish than not. At any rate, John quickly realizes there's something going on here. And he says, it has to be Jesus. And as soon as Peter hears those words, the Bible says he can't even wait for the ship to get back to shore. He immediately dives into the water and swims over to Christ. But there's a similar story that happens in the beginning when Jesus calls Peter, and I don't have time tonight to talk about it, but it would have rung a bell in their minds. It would have related to what happened to a situation very similar to that. I think it happened in Luke chapter 5 where it talks about Jesus telling them to cast their nets, and they once again get a great catch of fishes. But Peter nonetheless dove in and swam over to meet and to speak with Christ. Now again, I want to go back to what Jesus told these people whenever he first called them. In Mark chapter 1 and verse 17, he called them to be his disciples, and he says, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." And it's a great illustration as to how Jesus helps us fishing for lost souls or lost men today. We talked about how all our efforts are useless apart from following the directions of Christ. That's first and foremost. He's helped us. He's given us the directions that we need to catch lost souls. And so we have to follow those directions in order to accomplish what he wishes us to do. We have to have the courage to work. Fishermen, you're not going to catch fish if you don't fish. And the same is true with lost souls. We're not going to bring a person to Christ if we never try. You got to throw the line out, don't you? You got to make an effort. You got to put in the work in order to get the reward. You have to have enough faith and courage to go out into the deep. Sometimes when you fish deep water, you just got to have faith that there's fish out there and they're going to bite. And that's true, too, I think, when it comes to converting those who are lost. If we don't believe that we're going to convert anybody, do you think we're going to go out there and make an effort? No. We've got to have that faith and courage that there are fish in the deep and we're going to be able to catch them. The patience, the persistence, we talked about that. I think the most important lesson is this: never quit or give up, even after a hard day of catching nothing. You ever tried to convert people to Christ before and it didn't pan out? It's real easy to get discouraged, isn't it? It's real easy to give up and say, it's just not going to work. I'm not going to throw out the line anymore. But that's the thing about fishing. Don't catch fish every time you throw out the line. Just every once in a while, isn't it? You get a bite, unless you got really good fishing. You get a bite, and then you get to reel in a fish, and you get rewarded for that. But we've got to cooperate. We've got to become skilled in using the equipment that God has given to us. And if we obey, the short of the story is this: we'll catch fish. If they did what Jesus told them to do, they caught fish. And if we'll do what Jesus told us to do in catching lost souls, we'll be able to convert people to Christ too. I know that's a long first point, but I'll speed it up here. The second one: we are transformed by the resurrection of Christ because Jesus calls us to be sheep tenders. Now, again, I'm going back to the story of Peter here. And I want to bring up this idea that I've mentioned before. This is not the first time that Peter has spoken with the resurrected Christ. The Bible tells us that that Peter encountered Jesus, obviously in a private setting, before he ever appeared to any of the other disciples. And so this is the second time that Peter has witnessed Jesus resurrected from the dead. I imagine that they had a pretty good conversation in private the first time they met, don't you? There were a lot of loose ends that Peter left when Jesus died upon that cross and through his trial. And I have no doubt, knowing the type of person that Peter is, that he wanted to take care of those things while he had the opportunity. But now Jesus is speaking to Peter in a public manner before all the other disciples. And here's what he says to him in verse 15. Well, John records after they had dined that this is what Jesus says to Peter. He says, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these?" He said unto him, "Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee." He said unto him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again the second time, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me?" He said unto him, "Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee." He said unto him, "Feed my sheep." He said unto him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me?" Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, "Lovest thou me?" And he said unto him, "Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee." Jesus said unto him, "Feed my sheep." I've talked about it. We've studied this story before. I'm not going to use up all our time here talking about the two different words that are used for love here. But if you have an opportunity, look into that a little bit. It's kind of interesting conversation that takes place between Jesus and Peter. But the key issue of this conversation is Peter's love for Jesus. That's what's really being brought out and focused upon. And so Jesus asked him on 3 different occasions, he says, "Do you love me more than these?" The million-dollar question is, what was the these that Jesus was talking about here? And some people take the position, well, he's talking about, the boats or maybe the nets or the fish. Peter, do you love me more than the things of this world? It's a good lesson. It makes for a good sermon, don't get me wrong. But it's a question that we have to ask ourselves as disciples of Christ today. Do we love Jesus more than we love our job? Do we love Jesus more than we love our hobbies? Do we love Jesus more than we love the things of this world, whether it be money or physical possessions or any other thing that might draw us away from him? But I think the conversation went in even deeper than that. I think what he's talking about is a claim that Peter laid hold of right before Jesus was betrayed and put on trial and crucified. You remember when Jesus told all of his disciples that they were going to be offended because of him that very night? Peter made a very brazen statement. It's recorded in a few different places in the Bible, but one of them is found in Matthew 26 and verse 33. Here's what Peter says to Jesus whenever Jesus made that claim. He said, though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended. Peter openly professed a very strong love for Jesus Christ. And he even went as far, whether he meant to insult them or not, I don't know, but he even went as far to put his love in contrast with the love that the other disciples had for Jesus. And basically he said, not right outright, but by implication, I love you more than all these other guys love you. I would never do that to you. I would never be offended because of you. All those might be offended, but I would never be offended. My love for you is greater than their love for you. And so you have to believe in Jesus's mind, or in Peter's mind, that he thought his love his love for Christ superseded the love that the other disciples had for Christ, that it was greater than theirs. And I think that's really what Jesus is asking him. You know, Peter, do you love me more than all these guys love me? You remember what I told you? You know, all of you guys are going to forsake me and flee. You told me you weren't going to do that, but you did. You were just like all these other guys. You know, the fact that he asked Peter that on 3 different occasions, you know, a lot of commentators match that to the 3 denials of Peter. I think there's great significance in that. But the third time, the Bible says Peter was emotionally touched, you know, by the fact that Jesus asked this same question for the 3rd time in a row. And so Peter says the only thing that he knows what to say. He says, you know everything. And you know my great love for you. And even though Peter did have faults, and even though he did fail from time to time, he did love the Lord, didn't he? And he was not ashamed to admit it in front of other people. You know, there's a special application in this for Peter, because when he told Peter to take care of his sheep, I think what he was speaking specifically of in Peter's aspect is the fact that Peter was going to be an elder in the Lord's church. You know, that is the job of an elder. The Bible describes it as a shepherd, or tending the sheep, or taking care of the flock. And Peter talks about that position in 1 Peter 5 and verse 1, when he's writing to elders, and he said, the elders which are among you I exhort, who am also a fellow elder. Peter was an apostle. Peter was a preacher. Peter was an elder in the Lord's church. Did he love the Lord? Was he fully committed to Jesus? Yes, without a shadow of a doubt. And that's the picture of a man who has great love for the Lord. You know, I think about that sometimes. I think about, you know, it's a job being a preacher. It's a job. I've never been an elder, but I imagine it's a job being an elder. Well, I know it is. I don't imagine. Not by experience, but I know that it is. And it's a job. You think about being an apostle in the first century. That meant you had to travel all over the world and tell people about what you had witnessed, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That guy was committed. And he's a guy who fully loved the Lord. But because he loved the Lord, he took care of the Lord's sheep. Now, again, the application for us is a little bit different. Not all of us are going to be elders in the Lord's church, right? Not all of us are qualified to be elders in the Lord's church. But can we all care for the flock? Can we all care for the sheep and tend to them and watch out for them and help protect them? Yeah, the enemy of Christ wants to destroy the sheep. And so it's our job, if we are faithful, if we are true followers of Christ, then we're going to be sheep tenders also. The third area in which Peter was called to be transformed is to be a disciple, or we might put it in this way, a follower of Christ. Notice in verse 18, here's what Jesus says. He says, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. In verse 19, it says, This spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said unto him, Follow me. You notice how abruptly the conversation shifts from Peter and Jesus to the idea of love to death. I think that probably had to be a little startling for Peter, you know, because here's Jesus, and the next thing that Jesus wants to talk about is his death. I've just got restored, and you want to talk about me dying? But, you know, we're not ready to live and live for and serve Christ until we're ready to die. Until we're ready to give up our life for his cause. And Here's what Jesus told him. He says, right now you get to do whatever you want to do. But he says, one day somebody's going to carry you where you don't want to go. And you're going to die. Tradition tells us that Peter was crucified upside down on the cross because he didn't think himself worthy to be crucified upright as Jesus was. I don't know how true that story is. It might be, it might not. But I do know this. Here's what Jesus said about his death. It wasn't a tragedy. He said, he didn't say you're going to die a tragic death. He said you're going to glorify God in the way that you die. And that's the most important thing. You think about the death of Jesus Christ. Did the death of Christ glorify God? Absolutely. And that should be our main concern. Our main concern with being a disciple of Christ shouldn't be, do I get to live or do I have to die? Our main concern should be, whatever I do, is it going to glorify God? And so we have to develop this attitude. Paul had that attitude. He talked about it in Philippians chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. He said his hope and his expectation was to have boldness and to not be ashamed. But here's what he goes on to say. He said, Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. What was Paul's greatest concern? It was glorifying God. It was magnifying Christ. And he said, I don't care if that means me having to die in order to do that, or if it means me staying alive. I just want to glorify God. I just want to bring honor to the name of Christ. And so Peter was given this prediction of what was going to happen to him. He was going to glorify God in his death. You probably know the rest of the story. Peter, I guess he turns around and looks at John, sees John somehow anyway. He said, well, what about this fellow over here? What's going to happen to him? You know what Jesus said? He said, none of your business, you follow me. And here's what we have to understand being a disciple. God has a plan for each one of us. My plan's not your plan. Okay? God has a plan for each one of us. My job as a disciple is to follow God's plan for me. Whether that means living, whether that means dying, God's got a plan for my life to glorify Him. And I have to be willing to follow that plan. And I can't be worried about what everybody else's plan is or how long they get to live before they depart from this life. That the book, though, of John, it ends with Peter and John following Jesus together. Think about what might have happened to them had they not trusted Christ, had they not been transformed by Him, had they not followed Him. They wouldn't have been successful. We wouldn't even know their names today. But because they did those things, their names are forever etched into history. Jesus Christ transformed their lives by His resurrection. He's still transforming lives today. Wherever He finds a person who's willing to yield to His will, to listen to His word, and to follow His way, He begins to transform that person. And He accomplishes remarkable things within their life. Through Jesus' resurrection, we become fishermen today. Through Jesus' resurrection, we become sheep tenders today. Through Jesus' resurrection, we learn to be His disciples and to follow Him wherever that may lead us. But we can only succeed if we're willing to allow the resurrection of Christ to transform us. Maybe there's